Alright, today we got in this white Series 4 GU. It's currently fitted with a ZD30 Auto, and as of course we're going to pull that out and fit up an LSA and a 6L90. So before we can do that, we'll have to pull this motor and box out. If you enjoy this kind of content, it always helps out the channel if you can like and subscribe. Alright, we've got this motor and box out now, and as you can see it's pretty dirty in here, as most of them are. So the first thing we're going to do is get the pressure washer and the pool out and give it a good clean. After we've got it all cleaned up, we'll need to modify the engine mount post, remove these fuel lines and fit up the heat shield. So we'll go and set up the pressure washer and inflate the pool and get this thing cleaned up. Now we've got the petrol oil cleaned up, we can have a look at the LSA that we'll be fitting. This one's a crate motor and he's got a bigger pulley on the crank for a little bit more boost. I'll have to take the sump off this and we'll fit up the Marks mounts and all the accessory kit. We'll also take off these factory cast manifolds because we'll be using the stainless steel extractor kit that comes from Marks. I'll also be doing a trinion upgrade to this, so we'll get the rockers out and we'll head over to the bench. I got the factory rockers and rails off the LSA. and as you can see, these have a limited range of motion. And the new style will be able to completely rotate, which will eliminate any bind. As well as upgrading the needle roller bearings. These are different to the factory needle rollers as they have their own cage. You'll see what I'm talking about when we get the other ones apart. And these bearings get pressed in and retained with these circlips. So hopefully we don't end up with any needle rollers in the sump. You don't need any special tools when doing this. You just need two sockets, one that will go over the bearing, or one that will slide through the rocker arm. You can also do this in a bench vise, but I'm going to use the press today because it's much easier. The kit also comes with these two installation washers, which will help you press in the new bearings. So over at the press now, we've got our big socket sitting on the base, and we'll put our rocker on top, and we'll use the thinner socket to press out the old bearing. If you're using a press, it is easy to break these, so you want to make sure you get everything lined up first. And once you're happy it's all pretty straight, you can apply a little bit of pressure with the press, and then we can check things for alignment. With a small amount of pressure on it, I can still move things around to get things 100%. And once I'm happy it's all straight, I can press the bearing out. It doesn't take a lot of pressure to push these out, so if it does bind up, check you're not hitting on the bottom socket. Alright, both of those bearings pressed out easily. We can just take the rest of this and chuck it in the bin. So that's one done and 15 more to go, but for now we'll move on to pressing in the new bearings and shaft. So I'm going to take my empty rocker arm and we'll sit it on the base plate, and we'll grab our new bearing and we'll just use some flat bar to press it in. This is just an offcut that I had sitting next to the press. You could use anything that's flat, so you press the bearing in square. So bear with me while I line this up and then we can press the bearing in. And now I've lined that up, we can just press the bearing straight down. We want to press this bearing all the way so it's nice and flush. Just be careful how much pressure you apply at the end there, otherwise you'll snap it straight in half. And once we're done, we can just check the bearings flush with the side of the rocker arm. And then we can get the shaft and the other bearing and press that in. So I'll take the new shaft and we'll push it through the bearing, knocking out the plastic cup. Just make sure you don't drop any of the roller bearings when you do this. And then we'll take one of the installation washers and put it underneath the rocker arm and make sure it's centered with the shaft. And then we take our other bearing and sit that over the top of the shaft. You can use the installation washer to press this all in one go, but I prefer to use a little bit of flat bar and just press it down till it's flush. Once I've got the bearing pressed about halfway down and it's flush with the shaft, I'll take the rocker and I'll push up the shaft so it pokes out the top bearing, and that will allow me to locate it with the top installation washer. Once it's halfway out the bearings on both sides, I can sit it back down and put on the top installation washer. And then I can take my flat bar and socket and press it all into place. Now I've got it pressed all the way down, all I need to do is fit the two circlips and we're done. Alright, we've got both of the circlips on and the new bolt fitted. As I said before, one down and 15 more to go. And there we have it, all 16 of them done. It's not overly difficult, it just takes a little while to do. So we'll get these fitted back up along with the new sump and mounts and we'll take a look. Alright, we've got the rocker gear back on now along with the sump and the mounts. I haven't done the alternator relocation yet, but we have done the AC relocation on the driver's side. As usual, we'll be using their low mount kit, which takes the VT to VZ AC compressor off of LS1, so don't get that confused when you're using a 6 litre. Back over to the Patrol now. Scotty's already drilled out the engine mount to receive the new engine mount rubbers, as well as grinding off that little tab on the driver's side mount. As well as relocated the fuel lines and fitted up the heat shield. All that's left to do now is fit up the engine to the bay. Alright, there you have it. We've got it loosely sitting on the engine mounts now, as well as fitting the new Mark's alternator relocation for the LSA. Just for now, I've got the harmonic balancer sitting on a piece of wood until we can get the gearbox fitted. Before we can do that, we'll have to fit up the transfer case adapter, so we'll go and have a look at that. For this one, the customers supplied a 6L90 out of a Savannah. They are a bit different to the 6L80, but for our application, the only thing different is the shaft size. The one on the left is for the 6L90, and you can see how much smaller the one for the 6L80 is. But regardless of what style you have, you'll need to cut down the shaft because it's too long. One other thing you have to do is fit the seal to the transfer case adapter, and you want it so the flat side of the seal is facing up. So I've already gone ahead and marked the output shaft where I need to cut it. The instructions will state how far off the back of the gearbox you need to cut, and the easiest way is to use a square to measure off this surface. For the 6L90 it needs 85mm. Just using an angle grinder, I've cut the end of the output shaft off. You'll always end up with these little cut marks in the end of the shaft, like on this stub. But make sure you polish it up and chamfer the end for the gearbox. And once you're all happy with that, you can slide on the new splined adapter. The new adapter doesn't use the old O-ring to seal it to the back of the gearbox, so you got to use silicone. And whenever you're relying on silicone, it's good to rub it into the surface, so if there is any oil there, you'll feel it straight away. And I'll do this on both sides of the flanges, just applying a small amount. And once you've got both sides done, you can bolt the adapter up using the original bolts. We've got the adapter bolted up to the back of the gearbox now. Before you do it, just make sure you got that spline adapter in there, because it won't go in afterwards. The transfer case bolts directly up to this adapter, but I'm going to leave it off for now to make it easier to fit the gearbox. We've got the gearbox bolted up now along with the transfer case. The customer had this beefed up cross member, which we've had to modify. We had to take a little bit out to clear the transfer case adapter, along with re-drill where the mounts sit. Usually this adapter kit will take the manual cross member for the auto conversion, but in this case we just had to modify what was already there. So the customers also dropped off this beefier diff. We'll have to get the original ZD30 diff out and fit this up before we can get the tail shaft done. Alright, so we got this new diff fitted up. This one does have a much larger pinion than the other one, so we can't just use the manual tail shafts we would in a normal 6L80 conversion. Now usually on a 6L80 conversion the transfer case gets pushed back, and we can fix that by using manual tail shafts for the auto conversion. But since we're using a 6L90 and that diff, none of this is going to work. So for this job I sent both tail shafts down to final drive to get modified. You can see they've lengthened the front shaft because the transfer case has gone back, and we've had to significantly shorten the rear shaft. While Scotty's fitting up those tail shafts, we'll quickly go over the exhaust. As I do for all of these conversions, I've used the stainless steel kit. These are the extractors you receive, along with the crossover pipe, and these are a direct bolt-in for this conversion. One thing I always recommend is taking these gaskets and putting them in the bin, and then get yourself a set of MLS gaskets. Here's the part number if you need it. Along with the extractors, you can order a full cap back system, which I'd also recommend to buy in stainless. It lasts much longer and it sounds much better. And while you're there, pick up a set of new oxy sensors, because there's no point mucking around with the old ones. So Scotty's already got the tail shafts and the exhaust fitted up, and as you can see these systems fit quite well. Using the off-the-shelf system is great because it saves me a lot of time having to build one from scratch. But now we've got all of that done, we can get this rear fuel tank out and start on the fuel system. I've showed this before in some of my other videos, so we'll be quick, but we've modified the diesel sender to accept the fuel pump, along with drilling a hole in the lid for the new pass-through terminal. And on the other side of the terminal we'll run this purple wire down to the plug, as well as fitting an external earth strap. And it's also important to use in-tank fuel hose, as normal EFI hose just swells up and disintegrates. And for this one, instead of the Raceworks pump, we're using a Warrow 460 litre an hour to keep up with the supercharger. I use these 3-port fuel pressure regulators for the patrols. The top 2 ports are common, and it will bleed off excessive pressure through the bottom port. So how we'll plumb this up is one of the top ports will go to the fuel pump, the other will go to the rail, and the bottom port will go back to the return on the tank. Now you can run the regulator in the engine bay, but I prefer to put them back near the tank so we don't have to use the return line, and we can use that for the purge solenoid. As for the fuel filter, I put it behind the transfer case. I just cut the factory line and flare each end. On the LSA, the fuel line is on the passenger side, so we just run a rubber hose down to the relocated fuel line, and this other one we've run up and over to the purge canister. We had a look at the AC relocation bracket earlier, but this is the pipe kit that Mark sell, along with the compressor manifold, which keeps the lines away from the chassis rail. If you're using this style manifold, bolt it up to the compressor first and make sure you fit this bolt because you'll never get it in once it's bolted to the compressor. Moving on to the cooling system, I've showed this before, but we've cut out the centre of the ZD30 fan shroud and we've sticker flexed in some VXSS thermo fans. Once it's dry, we'll clean it up with a razor blade. This will keep it nice and tight against the radiator and make it easy to take in and out. For the bottom radiator hoses, we'll be using them from VXSS Commodore along with the factory crossover pipe, and the top hose is from a VZSS, and we'll cut that in half, and then we can fit this aluminium bypass adapter, and that'll give us a fitting to run to the head bleed pipes. And lastly, we'll just be using some 16mm heater hose to run to the heater core. And that's all I'll need to plumb up this LSA into the Patrol. So I've got all of the hoses fitted now, along with the thermo fans. And down here you can see we've got the AC and power steering lines done, along with the Commodore factory crossover pipe fitted below the radiator. And over on the other side we can have a look down here and see the AC compressor and lines, as well as the bypass adapter. On the LSA there's one on each head, so we've got a T-piece on the bypass adapter. You can see one of the ports behind the tensioner here, and then if we follow the other hose around, we can see the port next to the throttle body. So that's a cooling system for the engine side of things done. One other thing we will have to do is plumb up this intercooler. We'll have to make up some lines, fit up a coolant header tank along with the intercooler. Another thing the customer's dropped off is some new rotors and pads for his new diff, so we'll get them fitted up. And another thing he's dropped off is this hydraulic brake booster. You can also buy this kit from Mark's Forward Drive. It comes with all of the brackets and everything you need to plumb it up, including these braided brake lines and 2 hydraulic lines to hook it up to the power steering system. So we've got this hydraulic booster fitted up now and all of the lines run. It just bolts to the factory master cylinder and up against the firewall. As for the hydraulic power steering hoses, one of them runs down to the power steering box and the other side runs around to the power steering pump. Both hoses have already got the banjos fitted that you need. It also has a return line which you can just run into a T-piece for the power steering return. Moving on to the gear shifter now. I've said before that I like to keep the factory shifter just because it looks nice and clean, but we will need to modify it a little bit. I've used a die grinder to grind out the front gate so we can push the shifter a little bit further forward. You can see I've made the gate about double the size it was before, and I've also had to trim back the tab that's at the top of the shifter. The last thing I need to do is cut down and drill a small hole in the shifter arm. For the shifter cable I make up these 2 brackets. One of them bolts up to the transfer case and the other bolts to the side of the gearbox, and then we have the little paddles that go onto the gear selector on the gearbox. I make these from scratch these days, but you can rob it from the factory shifter rod on a Commodore. And I've drilled a small hole in it to receive the tie rod on the end of the cable. As for the cable, we'll be using an IS83BB-1500 from Flexible Drive. Now underneath the car you can see one of the brackets bolted up to the transfer case, and we've got the shifter cable running through that bracket and connected to the gear selector. I've got Scotty sitting up in there so you can see how it works. And round on the other side you can see the cables connected to the paddle and the little bracket that bolts it to the side of the gearbox. Next up we'll get onto the wiring. We've got ourselves another loom from Alan at Calmaker. His looms come standalone with all of the relays and fuses. This plug is for the tap up tap down module, and then we've got the fuel pump, ignition, tacho wires, stuff like that. This black wire is the main earth for the harness, and this red one down here is the main power that picks up from the alternator. Since it is an LSA, these two big plugs here go to the injector and core looms. They are a separate sub harness for each side of the engine, but they both just plug into these blue plugs. And then down here we've got the two blue wires for the thermo fans, and then the purple, which is the starter trigger, which has the neutral safety through the gearbox. Now that we've gone over that, we can have a look at the patrol body loom. I've showed how to do this in a couple of the other patrol videos, so I won't go over it all again. But this is the loom that goes down to the transfer case, and the yellow wire is for the oil pressure sender, and this smaller harness goes to the ZD30 computer to operate the tacho and the coolant temp gauge. It's also got a couple of earths which we'll need to fit up underneath the dash. So now it's time to fit up these couple of looms along with the old ZD30 computer. One last job before we're finished up is to do this intercooler system. I'll need to change out these push lock fittings for some dash 10 weld-ons. These are pressed in, they can be hard to get out, or you can just cut them off flush. Once we've got those fittings welded on, we'll need to find a spot to mount the coolant overflow tank. I'm thinking somewhere over here in the corner. And somewhere in behind the grill here, we'll mount up the intercooler. It shouldn't be too difficult, there's plenty of room, but I think we're going to have to relocate this power steering cooler. But once I get that moved back, I can make up a few brackets and we can mount up this intercooler in the space. So we'll head over to the bench now and I'll show you the intercooler and coolant tank we'll be using. With the space I had available with the winch in the way, I had to go for this short fat boy intercooler, and I'll be using this Bosch intercooler pump. I went down to Lost and got some Speedflow push lock fittings along with some dash 10 aluminium weld-ons. Two of the weld-on fittings will go into this intercooler and two will go into the intercooler on the LSA. Over here we have some push lock hose and a coolant overflow tank with a radiator cap. I've got the old push lock fittings out and the new dash 10 fittings sitting on top. Now I just have to weld these on without them leaking. I've got all of the fittings welded onto the intercooler as well as onto this coolant tank. I've also fitted some rib nuts to the side of the tank, as well as made up this bracket to give it a little bit of strength inside the car. Now I've decided to run this coolant tank down the back corner, but this piece of sheet metal doesn't have anywhere near enough strength, it's just going to flap around, and that's why I've made this bracket to stiffen it up a little bit. Now I've got the coolant tank all mounted up with the hoses on it, and we've filled it up full of water. It does have a little bit of movement, but at least it won't vibrate around anymore. Now, as for the intercooler, I've mounted it behind the grill like I said. I did have to relocate the power steering cooler, but we've made up some simple brackets on either end, and we've mounted the intercooler pump down here off to the side. And I've plumbed up the whole system using this push lock hose. You can see it runs from the intercooler to the pump, and then up over to the intercooler on the LSA, and loops back around to the coolant tank. One other thing we always do since we've deleted the clutch fan is fit a fan to the AC condenser, otherwise the thing will just cook itself. And we power this off its own relay up in the engine bay. Alright, we finished up the intercooler system and now it's finally time for that first start up. I've got Scotty sitting in there for me, so when he's ready we'll start it up. Alright, before we put it on the dyno, we'll just go over the gear selector and the tap up, tap down. As you can see, the display tells you what gear you're in, along with your engine and your trans temp and tacho. And then we have one of the switches which will go from normal to sports mode. You can see on the right hand side of the display it's saying normal and sports. And then the other switch will let you go into manual mode, and then you can go up and down gears from there. And then to get out of it, you just hit the other switch to go back into normal mode. And now for the time you've all been waiting for, we'll strap it down to the dyno and see how much it makes. Alright, so it made 462 horsepower on 35-inch tyres. That's not too bad. It made 500 foot-pound of torque. That's crazy for a four-wheel drive. Well, there you have it, an LSA 6L90 GU Patrol. What a great combo. Like I've said before, if I was going to have one myself, I'd definitely build an auto. The closer ratios of the 6-speed feels like it gives an extra 100 horsepower. As for this one, it made 460 horsepower and 500 foot-pound of torque at the tyres. I'm sure the customer's going to be more than happy with it, and I'm glad we fitted that hydraulic brake booster so he's able to stop it. And that marks the end of this video. And if you stuck around to the end, as always, thanks for watching.